You know what finally made me rethink everything I thought I knew about where my garden begins and ends? It was a Tuesday afternoon about 15 years ago, and I was standing in my garage surrounded by about $200 worth of colorful seed packets I'd just ordered online. I felt proud of myself, like I was prepared, but then I walked over to my Amish neighbor's place to return a hand tool, and I saw his young son spreading out these old, graying window screens in the sun. They weren't fixing windows. Those screens were covered in thousands of drying tomato seeds, squash seeds, and bean pods. He looked at my store-bought packets and just smiled, not in a mean way, but in a way that made me realize I was a customer while he was a producer. I'd been gardening for over a decade by then, and I realized I was still tethered to a supply chain that these families had cut ties with a century ago. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how they do it and how you can start using it in your own backyard so you never have to buy a packet of seeds again. And stick around to the end because I'll share a specific fermentation trick for wet seeds that ensures a nearly 100% germination rate next spring. For the first 20 years of my gardening life, I did what most of us do. I'd sit down in January with a glossy catalog, circle the prettiest pictures, and reach for my credit card. It worked fine. I grew good food, but there was always this underlying anxiety. What if the seeds don't ship? What if the variety I love gets discontinued? I was treating my garden like a seasonal project rather than a continuous cycle. When I started spending more time with the Amish and Mennonite families here in Lancaster County, I realized they don't see seed saving as a chore or a hobby. They see it as stewardship. There's a principle they live by called Gelassenheit, which is a complex word, but in the garden, it often manifests as a quiet yielding to the natural order. They don't fight the plant's desire to go to seed, they facilitate it. And here's where the science backs them up. University studies on regional adaptation show that when you save seeds from your own soil, the next generation of that plant is actually more resilient to your specific local pests and weather patterns than anything you can buy in a store. You're literally breeding a custom garden for your own backyard. The first thing Amish gardeners understand is that you have to choose your mother plants before you ever take a single bite of the harvest. Most of us eat the biggest, prettiest tomato and save the seeds from the scrawny one left on the vine at the end of the year. That's the opposite of the traditional way. I watched a Mennonite friend walk through his rows with bits of red yarn. He wasn't looking for a snack. He was marking the plants that showed the most vigor, the ones that didn't get hit by blight, and the ones that produced the earliest. By tying that yarn on the stem, he was telling his family, "Don't touch this one. This is next year's dinner." If you're in zone 6 or 7, you really want to look for those plants that handle that mid-August humidity without folding. Now here's where the Amish approach really comes together, and it starts with what they call the dry harvest. This is for your beans, peas, and corn. In a conventional garden, we want to pick beans when they're snapped and tender, but for the seed system, you have to leave a section of the row completely alone. You let those pods turn yellow, then brown, then brittle, until the seeds rattle inside like little stones. I'll be honest with you, it looks messy. Your neighbors might think you've given up on your garden because you have all these dead-looking brown vines hanging around. I struggled with that for years because I wanted my garden to look clean, but once I saw the bags of dried Jacob's cattle beans in an Amish pantry, I stopped caring about the aesthetics. You want to harvest these on a day with zero dew. If you're in a wetter climate like zones 3 through 5, you might even pull the whole plant up and hang it upside down in a shed to finish drying so the seeds don't mold in the pod. This next piece is one that I completely overlooked for most of my gardening life, and it's how they handle heavy seeds like squash and pumpkins. Most people just scoop the guts out, rinse them in a colander, and throw them on a paper towel. But I noticed an Amish neighbor doing something different. He leaves the squash on the vine until the first light frost kills the plant, then he moves those squash into a cool cellar for another month. He told me the seeds are actually still maturing inside the fruit even after it's picked. They're drawing the last bit of energy from the pulp. When he finally opens them, the seeds are plump and heavy. He tests them by dropping a handful into a bucket of water. The sinkers are kept for planting and the floaters are fed to the chickens. It's a closed-loop system where nothing is wasted. Now, let's talk about the tricky stuff. The greens and the root vegetables. This is the part that surprised me the most. To get seeds from a carrot or an onion, you have to realize they are biennials. They won't give you seeds in the first year. In Lancaster County, I've seen families dig up their best carrots in October, trim the tops to an inch, and bury them in a pit of damp sand in the cellar. Then, they replant those same carrots the following March. The plant thinks it has survived winter and immediately sends up a huge, beautiful flower head that looks like Queen Anne's lace. One single carrot can give you 1,000 seeds. If you're down in zones 8 or 9, you can often just leave them in the ground with a heavy mulch, and they'll bolt the moment the spring sun hits them. I want to be upfront here because I think honesty matters more than hype. This isn't a standalone trick. Seed saving is one piece of a system, and the system is what makes the difference. If you're growing hybrid seeds, those packets labeled F1, you can't save them and expect the same vegetable next year. They'll revert to something weird and usually inedible. The Amish only grow open-pollinated or heirloom varieties. You have to start with the right genetic bones if you want the system to work. If you're picking up what I'm putting down and you want more of these deep dives into how Amish families approach the garden, hit subscribe. I've got a lot more of these coming. Now, let's keep going. I've noticed a few patterns over the years that tend to trip people up when they transition to this way of growing. I did these myself for years, so no judgment here. The first is the cross-pollination catastrophe. I remember growing 3 types of squash right next to each other and saving the seeds. The next year I grew something that looked like a pumpkin but tasted like a bitter cucumber. The Amish prevent this by staggering their plantings or by only growing one variety of a species in a small garden. They understand the neighborhood of the garden in a way we often forget. Another pattern is the moisture mistake. We think a seed is dry because the outside feels hard, but any internal moisture will rot the seed in the jar over winter. Yeah, and I've seen Mennonite families use a simple hammer test. If you hit a seed with a hammer and it smooshes, it's not dry. If it shatters into powder, it's ready for the jar. It's a blunt, honest way to know for sure. And finally, many gardeners store their seeds in the kitchen. I did this too because it was convenient, but the heat and humidity of a kitchen are seed killers. My neighbors store theirs in the coolest, darkest part of the basement or even in a buried seed vault in the floor of a barn. Now, here's something I picked up from an Amish family that I haven't seen mentioned in any gardening guide, and it's how they handle wet seeds like tomatoes and cucumbers. These seeds have a gel coating that actually contains growth inhibitors. It's nature's way of keeping the seed from sprouting inside the warm, wet fruit. To get rid of it, they use fermentation. You squeeze the tomato guts into a jar with a little water and let it sit on your counter for 3 days until a layer of white mold forms on top. It smells a little funky, I'll be honest, but that mold eats away the gel coating and kills off seed-borne diseases. After 3 days, you pour off the mold, rinse the seeds, and dry them. Since I started doing this, my tomato germination went from okay to nearly every single seed popping out of the soil within 5 days. It's a simple, ancient way of mimics the natural rotting process on the forest floor. That's what I've learned from Amish and Mennonite gardeners about closing the loop and reclaiming your seeds. It's about more than just saving a few dollars, it's about owning the entire life cycle of your food. If any of this changed how you think about those seed packets in your garage, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Do you save your own seeds, or is there something holding you back? Hit subscribe if you want more of these deep dives into how traditional communities grow food with methods that have worked for generations. Thanks for spending time with me today. I'll see you in the next one.